So everyone, welcome to this talk. This talk is organized by the Artificial Intelligence Research Lab here at the Institute of Computing. This lab is also known as Reasoning for Complex Data, or ReCOD. Today, I have the pleasure to have here with us Sam Gregory. I've met Sam a couple of years back when we had like a workshop in Sao Paulo to discuss this very subject of deepfakes. Many things changed since then. Many algorithms evolved in terms of creation and also in terms of detection of such deepfakes. And I'd like to thank Sam for accepting to give this talk today. He will be able to explain many interesting things about this topic. He planned the talk to be around 45-50 minutes, and then we can go for questions. The idea is to have a live discussion at the end. Sam is the program director of Witness, witness.org, which helps people use video and technology to defend human rights. Sam's current work focuses on the threats and opportunities as emerging technologies such as AI intersect with disinformation, media manipulation, and the rising of authoritarianism. So Sam, thank you very much for joining us today, and feel free to share your screen right now.
Thank you, Anderson, and thank you for the invitation to join this talk at ReCOD, and very glad of the opportunity. A lot of this work that I'm going to talk about here has been driven in collaboration with talking with collaborators like yourself in Brazil and my colleagues who are based in Brazil. So it's a real pleasure to loop back. I'm going to share my screen to present some slides. Good. Well, again, delighted to be here to talk to you about these three things. How do we think about this phenomenon of deepfakes? So new ways driven by artificial intelligence to manipulate audio, video, and create realistic impressions of things that never existed. Also to talk about the harms and talk about the solutions. And I do that particularly from a perspective that's very global and very much about thinking about human rights and harms to the most vulnerable communities. I'm Sam Gregory. I'm the program director of the human rights group Witness. We work globally, helping people who use video and technology to use it as effectively and ethically as possible. Our global scope includes work in the US, it includes work in Latin America, including in Brazil, as well as in sub-Saharan Africa, the Middle East, and Asia. And as I mentioned, we help people use video technology to protect and defend human rights. And I want to say that's the starting point at which I come to thinking about deepfakes, which is I come from the point of view of thinking about, the millions of people around the world who, for example, have taken out their cell phones to document police violence or to show a war crime or to show something that's wrong in their communities. And I often, when I think about this sort of explosion that's happened in the last 15 years, I think about this quote. It's from an American author, Ta-Nehisi Coates, that the violence isn't new, the cameras are new. So we have lots more people out there in the world trying to share their reality, often in social media, often in closed messaging apps like WhatsApp. And so a lot of my work is around how do you think about actually how do we make video more trustworthy? So in a world where people want to challenge the trust in video, how do we in fact make it more likely that you can believe, for example, a video that you see? And during that work, I've worked building technologies. So for example, worked with a group called the Guardian Project to build tools that add metadata and add rich data and hash pieces of media you film on your phone in order to make them more trustworthy as evidence. But I've also spent a lot of time thinking about the problems of people claiming that, in fact, some of this footage is false. So repeatedly in the work that a group like Witness does globally, we see, for example, here, just in the last months in Nigeria, a general claiming that a video of a massacre, an attack on a protest, was fake, and that you can't believe anything you see. Now, before I transition to talking about our work on deepfakes, Let me also say that my colleagues here in Brazil are a key part of the Witness Network and work very closely thinking about these issues here. I've placed a couple of links on this screen to their presence online, and certainly encourage you to look at some of the resources that they put out, both on issues like deepfakes and manipulated media, but also how we prove the trustworthiness of videos and photos and use them for justice. Let me turn to the issue of deepfakes. So about 3 years ago, at Witness, we started noticing the technical trends towards what are known as deepfakes. So this was developments in generative adversarial networks, or GANs, and in some related fields, of techniques that made it easier to manipulate video and audio. And we saw that it was very important to try and really bring together people to think about how we should understand the threats from technologies when they're used in malicious ways and potential solutions. So over the last 3 years, we've done a series of workshops, including 3, 2 physical and 1 online with Brazilian journalists, fact checkers, and activists, along with many other regions like Southeast Asia, you see on this map, the US, as well as specific discussions trying to understand specific issues around deepfakes, like, for example, their use in satire and parody, to enable us to better advocate for what we describe as a prepare, don't panic approach to deepfakes. And I will explain more about that as we talk. So I want to cover 3 areas. We've got the jumping up there. I want to cover 3 areas in this talk. The first is kind of what is actually happening with manipulated media at the moment. So how do we place a phenomenon like deepfakes in a bigger context of how people manipulate video and audio? Then I want to talk about how we think about them in a global context of threat assessment and solution prioritization. So how do we think about the harms from deepfakes, and how do we prioritize potential solutions? And then I particularly want to focus on 2 areas of solution that I think this group will find interesting. How we think about deepfakes detection solutions that often emerge from the same technical advances as the synthesis, right? So you may use the generative adversarial networks you use to, the same types of advances you use to generate a deepfake may also be relevant to how you detect a deepfake. And I'm also going to talk about what are known as provenance and authenticity solutions. These are ways in which you can track, for example, the origins of a piece of media. So let me just start by placing this in the context of current and emerging threats of media manipulation. So I think it's really important with something like deepfakes, when we're talking about the potential harms, to place this in a context of what people already do with media manipulation. So, you know, I've spent the last 10 years looking at what people do to manipulate videos and audio. And the vast majority of manipulation online are what we think of as miscontextualized videos. So I take a video from one time and place, and I claim it's from another. This was, I take a video from Rio in 2016 and I say it's Sao Paulo in 2017. I take a video from India in 2016 showing a burning building, and I claim it's showing an incident of violence in South Africa in 2019. And we've also seen a lot of sort of edited and manipulated videos. And all of these types of videos are integrated into a series of disinformation strategies that I won't talk in detail about here, but are things like the idea of a fire hose of falsehood. This is something that people who work on misinformation and disinformation describe when someone shares lots and lots of false stories to confuse people. You don't know which version to believe. So we can see most of these trends playing out in some recent high-profile contexts. So for example, in the US elections, we had our elections last year, who saw a number of doctored videos that, for example, showed now President Biden implying he was senile or had dementia. You also had a lot of people trying to claim that real videos were false or were edited or faked. For example, a video here that showed then President Trump speaking from a hospital where he was being treated for COVID-19. And online, lots of people were like, no, this has been faked. And there was a lot of conspiracy theories actually about videos being faked when in fact they were real. And I'm going to come back to that later to talk about one of the biggest threats from deepfakes, which is the ability to claim that real is false when it is in fact real. You've seen some of these phenomena in Brazil. I picked up two recent examples featuring former President Lula, but we could look at many examples from Brazil. In this case, these two examples were a video manipulated on the speed to imply that he was drunk, and another one where someone had edited the order of the audio. And then during COVID-19, we saw lots and lots of what I described as these videos that were miscontextualized. And at Witness, we often call these shallow fakes. So videos that are claimed to be from one place, but are from another. So for example, here in the video on screen, you see a video from Zimbabwe that shows a protest, and people shared it claiming it was a protest against COVID, but it was from another political protest. Or in the bottom right, this is a video from Hong Kong showing repression of the democracy protests there, and people claim it is from the COVID lockdown. And 84% of the videos and images and media analyzed in a study early on in COVID were these types of either recontextualized or re-edited media, not fully fabricated, as we often think of deepfakes being. So with that introduction, let me talk a little more about deepfakes and what we think of as the possibilities of them. And I realize for a number of people on this call, this may be an area they are very deeply familiar with. So this is, the disadvantage of a broad range of audience that some of you, I suspect, may spend your everyday thinking about deepfakes, and others may be coming to this new. So I will keep it at a relatively high level technically, in order to make sure that we don't lose people. So I think one good way to think about deepfakes and the range of deepfakes is to think about the range of techniques represented in this slide. So here, I'm going to play on the left. This is an image animated with the app Deep Nostalgia that is of my grandmother as a young woman. And this was just a single shot. So this was an Israeli company that released an online app where you could place a single image. They'd pre-trained it to get those images to smile, and it required only one shot of the target of the deep faking. Now, by complete contrast, many of you will have seen, of course, the opposite end of the spectrum.
You guys cool if I play some sports? I love it. Or for the audio experience, as much as the momentum. Hey, listen up, sports and TikTok fans. If you like what you're seeing, just wait till what's coming next.
And so in this video, we're seeing, really a very accomplished deepfake, a face swap deepfake, in which we're made to believe that the actor Tom Cruise has joined TikTok. Now, the reason I show both of these is one end is the very commercialized, easy, requires very little data. At the other end, kind of the state of the art in doing a commercial deepfake for creative purposes or profit, where you have a very good impersonator of Tom Cruise underneath this. You have a very good creator of deepfakes, the creator Chris Ume, and you probably have some visual effects work after it. And I think often when we're looking at deepfakes, people focus very much on that end of the spectrum when they also want to think about harms. when in fact to do a deepfake this good is still largely out of the reach of most people. So I want to describe a few other kind of approaches we could be thinking of within deepfakes technology. I'm going to give the very layperson version of understanding deepfakes and generative adversarial networks. This will make Anderson cringe. But my summary essentially, as someone who is not an AI scientist, but thinks very practically about the applications of these tools and how we understand how these dynamics influence things like detection, is that we're providing the training data for most of these, right, to build a deepfake, to either develop the models or to build a deepfake of a specific person. We're providing the images of ourselves, the samples of our voices, whether it's one face to use in an existing pre-trained model or whether we're training a new model. We're placing that into a type of cat and mouse game between, in the case of a generative adversarial network, a generator and a discriminator, one trying to create a good forgery, the other trying to detect it, and seeing how that process can continually improve the ability to create this representation of a real object, for example, Tom Cruise's face. So as we look at the range of things we can do with deepfakes, again, as someone who thinks about malicious usages, I think it's really important to look at the whole range of things we can do with them. So, for example, one use of technologies that people often don't think of as deepfakes is what we think of as object edits. So, for example, the tools that are available in Adobe to remove an object in a video, right? And this can seem not very harmful until you think about the ways in which, for example, when journalists try and verify an image or video, they use clues inside a video to work out whether it actually happened in the place that it claims to be from. So this is a highly commercialized form of what I would describe as synthetic media. So something that is enabled by some of these advances in the deepfake space. And most of the examples I'm going to share now are things that are pretty established as either tools or research. So this is not going to the most cutting edge, it's going to the things that are starting to be used and deployed in the environments in which I work. Another one that is, in fact, at this point, 3 or 4 years old in terms of research is research from Nvidia, looking at how we can change the background in a video, right? Make something have a different weather pattern. Again, may not seem all that harmful until you think about, for example, how you verify if a video did take place in a time and place, right? Did it take place in winter? Did it take place in summer? Another area that's well established now would be this area of creating objects that never existed, but look like a realistic example. So, you can think of this genre of this X does not exist. So this cat does not exist, this rental does not exist, this person does not exist. And I think, as we know in this call, this has been advancing rapidly. This image is well known and takes you through to 2018. What we've been seeing in the last year or so is the ability to more readily customize those images, to tweak them, to think about how you modify them. I think it's well worth thinking also as we talk here about some of the advances where there's a lot of papers coming out right now. So NERF technologies, so neural radiance fields, where you're talking about 3D representations of scenes that never existed that you can move within. So, for example, here I'm creating a face that never existed. With NERF approaches, you're looking, of course, at creating a scene that never existed and be able to move within it. So this area of creating realistic images of things that never existed is progressing fast. We've been seeing it used in kind of mis and disinformation work in increasing amounts. This is one of the early ones. It was called Operation FFS, Operation Fake Face Swarm, and was used to cover up a network of fake Twitter accounts that were engaging in disinformation. Some other trends in terms of technology, again, this is old technology here, the ability to transfer expressions to someone else. I think the area that we're seeing development in this area is, of course, around trying to think how this applies, for example, to manipulation of someone in a conference call or a Zoom call. If you can map expressions, if you can map someone's apparent lip movements to a representation of an individual, how can that be used maliciously? another example where, this is work from 2 or 3 years ago that is now present in an app, right? And I think one of the things we need to think about is the trajectory of these tools from research in elite universities like your own into apps. So this is the area of what we might call do as I do motion transfer. So this is, the ability to transfer the motion from typically a real person to a representation. So, if we look at this in video format, something like this. So transfer from the source video to the target results, of course, a representation of a real person made to dance as if they were a professional dancer. And let me come to the final 2 areas, which are, progressing at quite a speed. And I think lip sync dubbing, and here's a video that people are probably familiar with that was made by artists actually close to 2 years ago now, that made the Facebook founder Mark Zuckerberg confess to stealing our data. So the ability to do lip sync dubbing is improving. And we've seen that in some of the commercialization that is starting to happen of companies like Synthesia, based out of Europe, that are providing an increasing number of, essentially avatars to companies that can speak in multiple languages or speak pre-prepared tracks without requiring human actors. So let me end with the Tom Cruise one again, and I end there just to remind people that I think we focus a lot on these face swaps, but as we move into thinking about the harms from deepfakes or the potential harms, we need to be very attentive to that whole range I've just described. Right? The ability to make someone dance can also be used to make them appear drunk. The ability to manipulate someone's face in a static call-like environment can be manipulated in a Zoom-like environment. So how do we think about these questions as we move forward? So some emerging possibilities with deepfakes: alter video like with photos, create a realistic voice or face of a human who never existed, and manipulate the video or audio of someone's lips, voice, face, or body to make it appear someone said or did something they never did. Now, at this point, you may be thinking something along the lines of, well, this is all very interesting, but where do I actually see deepfakes taking place in the real world? And I think this is a valid question to ask is, should you be worried? And I think this is important to ask because a lot of our focus in the witness work has been what we describe as a prepare, don't panic position. And this is very different from how often we see this presented in the media. So this is a good example from the US media in the 2020 elections, where, experts say deepfakes could swing the 2020 elections. I don't know which expert said that, but I don't think that was actually very much the likelihood, right? And this makes people start to think, A, that we're surrounded by deepfakes, and B, that we should focus our attention primarily on, say, the US elections rather than other contexts. So what have we actually seen in terms of deepfakes? So, in the real world, we've started to see deepfakes used for campaigns. For example, people making a deepfake of their political opponent. We've seen them a lot in satire. And I think a lot of the work in, for example, in Brazil, of the satirist Bruno Sartori, satirizing political figures in Brazil. And we've seen it used for fun, right? So, this is an example of someone using wave to lip to make President Trump say silly things.
Scooby-Doo, they call him Scooby-Doo. They call show Scooby-Doo. But Scooby doesn't do anything. Scooby is not involved.
And this is, in some sense, just harmless fun. And what we've also seen is an increasing number of integration of deepfakes, GAN-generated images into disinformation campaigns. So this was one from a campaign targeting the son of then candidate Biden, and the face behind the campaign was a faked image created with a GAN. Now, all of this is to say, maybe we shouldn't worry, or maybe we should. And the reason that at Witness we continue to focus on deepfakes is because we recognize they're getting easier to do in general, with less data and increasingly without so much training needed on a specific target. We also see audio improving rapidly, as well as text, and developments such as NERF approaches that make it easier and more manipulable around, for example, creating scenes that never existed. And I think importantly, it's becoming more, right? So these are on mobile as a service, and our brains are not really well equipped to deal with video that is well faked. We've got used to photos, we have a cognitive layer, but we're not ready really for the experience of video in settings we don't expect not being real. So we expect a TV drama not to be real. We're not so ready for every social media video to have to question that. So in that light, let me now move to thinking about how we should think about threats in a global context. The way we've done that at Witness is really to do this by talking with people who have what we think of as lived and professional experience of similar threats. So when we brought folks together in Brazil, and in the top right, you'll see some of the participants, we wanted to have journalists and fact checkers there. We wanted people from community organizations and favela-based activism. We wanted leading technologists and AI specialists like Professor Rocha, all to come together to really think about how we talk about this prioritization of threats and solutions. And we've done that in multiple contexts globally. And there's lots of resources you can consult at the webpage here if you're interested to read more in depth. And there's also a report out from an in-depth meeting in Brazil in Portuguese that is available at this link here. And the first thing I want to say is, in every one of those meetings, the first people said that the biggest problem with deepfakes is not deepfakes, it's shallow fakes. It's the attention we need to place not on deepfakes, but on all those miscontextualized videos and photos that are what are circulated most. So for example, those videos that I showed from the COVID examples of a protest from one place claimed to be in another, or people just editing a video to make it deceptive what it shows in the video. So I think that's important as we think about solutions, to be attentive to that need to address those existing problems. What they also pointed to was that most deepfakes now, and the statistics confirm this, are non-consensual sexual images targeting women. So when we think about the threats from deepfakes, we should take our eyes away from political misinformation and think about the threats to ordinary women and to public figures, because they are who are being targeted now by deepfakes. One notable case was the journalist Rana Ayub in India, and in a recent survey, 4% of journalists globally said they'd been targeted by deepfakes. And this is one of the areas where we're seeing more and more these ability to do this with easy apps and tools. There was a bot on Telegram that enabled people to create realistic, well, semi-realistic nude photos of anyone if you uploaded their photo. And of course, this is only targeting women. You couldn't upload a photo of a man to this app. It would only superimpose the naked body of a woman on a photo you provided. The other thing that we heard was a concern with something called the liar's dividend. And so to explain what the liar's dividend is, this is the idea that if you are a liar, it is now easy to claim any video that is real is fake. So if a video comes out that shows a politician in a sexually compromising situation, or accepting money in a corruption deal, or a police officer shooting an unarmed civilian, the first response of authorities or the person is to say that's a falsification, that's a deep fake. And this is known as the liar's dividend. And this has implications in undermining our trust in videos and images, particularly in content from people without power. So for example, citizen journalists. And we heard this in all the meetings, this concern around undermining the power of many of us to share images and photos and not have them dismissed as lies. The other thing we heard as we listened globally was people saying, we get that people want to solve this. So there are many good researchers working on things like deepfakes detection, but to do that, we have to listen to the right range of people globally. So the work we've done at Witness is trying to think, how do you center people who have lived experience of these existing threats, particularly from a global perspective, particularly from the perspective of human rights and journalism. So what else did we prioritized threats? We did many exercises to prioritize threats. You see one here from a workshop that took place in South Africa, and really thought about how these threats played out in each of the contexts where the participants were from. And these were the main things we heard. The people worried about more threats to the people who are most at risk already. So less is President Trump going to be threatened, but more, how do journalists, particularly women journalists, civic leaders, particularly civic leaders who are Black or people of color, what risks do they face? We heard this repeating of the two themes I've mentioned already, the concern about gender-based violence, about undermining video as evidence and the use of it's a deep fake excuse against real footage. And we heard about how this played into current problems. So for example, that journalists, including in Brazil, are under-resourced and don't have the capacities to deal with this. And that this was a threat also in some of the spaces we use so much these days. So messaging apps like WhatsApp, and in Brazil, audio deepfakes as a real threat because of the way we rely on WhatsApp in Brazil for audio and for sharing. And how rapidly things can spread in that environment. And also, particularly over the last year, we heard concerns about online video conferencing and how fragile that is, how dependent we are on it, and already concerns about security and who's there and what they say. Really importantly for the work we do at Witness, we also really want to focus on solution prioritization that comes from people who will be most impacted. Solution prioritization can't just happen in Silicon Valley, Washington, DC, Brussels, Brasilia. It has to come from communities who are most impacted by these potential threats. And there's a lot of different solution areas we could explore around deepfakes, and there's not time in this call to talk about all of them. So I'm going to share some top line, then I'm going to focus on the detection and authentication, which also have important questions around how technical questions intersect with societal questions. So many solution areas, from how do we teach people to spot these, how do we build on existing skill sets that journalists have, through to what platforms and the AI industry and lawmakers should do about this. When we did these workshops globally, we heard these types of prioritizations. So first, that people said, we do need to think about media literacy that goes beyond deepfakes, right? For, say, someone who sees a video in their WhatsApp group from a relative or a community member, it probably doesn't matter whether it's a deepfake or a shallow fake. It matters how we think about providing people information that can help them make good decisions, know when to question something. And that needs to happen in the tools that people use, like WhatsApp or Facebook or YouTube or Instagram. And we need to focus that on particularly vulnerable communities. And in Brazil, community-based activists working in some of the largest favelas in Rio and Sao Paulo really said, look, think how to build this into the way in which communities communicate and the tools they use in those settings. We need tools for existing problems like shallow fakes. So repeatedly, we've heard people say, you know, work on tools for deepfakes, but don't forget these shallow fakes. And we need deepfake detection tools that are cheap and accessible and explainable. And I'm going to talk more about that in a moment. And available globally. not just for the BBC or New York Times or Folio de Sao Paulo, but for a range of media actors and civic actors globally. And you need to pair that with investing in journalists in order to help them understand what's happening. So let me talk about these two solution areas in the final part of this talk. So, and I'm going to describe these two solution areas as deepfake detection. How do we detect a deepfake after the fact? And then the second question, how do we use what are described as provenance or authenticity solutions, which are tracking, for example, where a piece of media came from, its location, its time, perhaps the identity of the creator, and relations over time. So, as I said, as I talk about this, a reminder that for many people, these are important, but we should always be centering that we still need better solutions around these shallow fakes, these miscontextualized or lightly edited videos. And I want to start with a story about detection access, because I think it's a helpful way to think about this. So this is a story from about 3 months ago in the country Myanmar in Southeast Asia. In Myanmar, there was a military coup that took place that threw out the democratic government. And as part of that, they arrested senior politicians. One of those senior politicians is the man you see in the video on the left. He was the chief minister of the main city of Myanmar, Yangon. And about a month after the coup, a video was released that showed him implicating the former de facto prime minister of Myanmar, Aung San Suu Kyi, in corruption. So very serious charges. And the video came out. I'm not going to play it, but in the video, you see him and it's in a very blank environment. His face looks a little distorted. His voice is not super clear, doesn't sound like him. He looks like he might be reading from a prepared text. And what happened was pretty much straight away, people placed it in an online detection approach for deepfakes because they're vicious. And this deepfake detector came back saying it was maybe 98% likely a deepfake. And very quickly on Twitter, you saw all these stories spreading saying, this must be a deepfake, the military know how to deepfake people. The problem with this is, and I'm going to talk about why this problem arose as we talk in the next section, is this probably wasn't a deepfake. This was a video that was shot of a man under duress, so being forced to say something. It was low resolution. The types of distortions around his mouth, for example, were probably due to compression. If it was a deepfake, it was a very good one because his chest moved up and down, for example, in time to his specific words. But for the public, it was very hard to make that judgment. And for journalists in Myanmar, they didn't know what to do either. So this is a story about the problems of how in the real world we help people detect deepfakes. So let me take a step back. And there is an effort at the moment to really think about deepfakes detection. And I point to a link here about some of the questions around this. This has included efforts led by Facebook, something called the Deepfake Detection Challenge, to invest more in this, and many university researchers are doing that. This is part of a range of government and industry-funded programs globally, and developing a whole range of algorithms to approach deepfakes. Most of them at this point are not reliable to enough certainty to use at scale, nor are they necessarily generalizable between different synthesis techniques. And in tandem with that, we're seeing these first releases of public platforms for the public to check if something's a deepfake. And the questions that are really coming up for us as we look at these different efforts, some are technical, right? Can we actually come up with a deepfake detection tool that's reliable enough to use? Others are very much about actually how do people have access to these tools? So for example, from the report that came out of the meeting we had in Brazil and some of the follow-up, we heard people saying, we need these tools, but they need to be cheap and available and need to be combined with capacity. So some of the questions that come up around deepfakes detection tools are these ones. For example, how relevant are these tools to actual real world scenarios? How available and accessible are they? And how useful are they when you need to do something like in the Myanmar case, explain to a suspicious public that something that looks like a fake isn't a fake? And are they being developed in complement with techniques for media literacy? So how do you explain to a public in the context of them and seeing it, for example, in a WhatsApp group? And are they being paired with capacity building for, say, journalists to do this well? So these questions have come up repeatedly in the discussions we have had in Brazil in other contexts. So how relevant are the approaches that people really encounter, right, to, for example, gender-based violence, where a fake doesn't need to be perfect, as well as to the scenarios people encounter where most videos are not pristine. So you can't train your model just to look for a perfect video. You have to focus on being able to detect, a range of manipulated, compressed videos or ones that have been laundered between different social media platforms. And we recently teamed up with the Partnership on AI to really conduct a series of focus groups with journalists and misinformation advocates and community leaders, including in Brazil, to really ask what they needed in terms of detection techniques. And a lot of their concerns focused on how to make this detection available to a wide range of actors. So, for example, in the meeting in Brazil, we heard two things. We heard people say, we need to find a way to give access to trusted intermediaries. So, for example, to trusted journalistics associations like Abraji, or to trusted media houses. But we also need alternatives that anyone can use, any member of the public who has suspicions. And we also need a way to escalate. So if there's a really tough piece of media manipulation, who do you go to? Who do you go to who are experts, who aren't necessarily just law enforcement or in the government? So there's a really complex set of questions that we need to be asking at the moment around how do we really build these detection tools that in a way that will fit with the needs of the people we will trust, hopefully, like journalists, as well as the needs of individuals who may want to have access to the type of tools that are available online. And when we do that, we've got to be really careful. One of the things that I'm most alert to is being careful that we don't try and train ordinary people to be deepfake sleuths, right? I often go back to this story from one of the early advances in deepfake detection, when an academic found that often deepfakes didn't blink. This was a piece of research that was very interesting. Unfortunately, very quickly, people built models that had deepfakes that blink, but still, when I talk to people, they still say, oh, I know how I can see a deepfake, it won't blink. And the problem here is we can't train people to spot what we might describe as the kind of current Achilles heel of an algorithm, right? So that was an Achilles heel of the algorithm, of the training data, of the models, of the way people were doing synthesis. And if you tell people that, they'll keep looking for that for years after that is not relevant to the way people make a deepfake. So instead, we need what we might think of as a media literacy informed by technical signals. So when I think about media literacy, I'm thinking about a methodology, and here's one we use in Witness's work called SIFT from the academic Mike Caulfield, which is nothing to do with like trying to see if the pixels are out of place. It's very much about when you encounter a piece of media, stop, pause, don't share it, investigate the source, find out where it was shared from, find better coverage, see if someone else has, for example, tried already to investigate this, like a professional investigator or journalist, and then trace the back to its origins. So the same way we looked at those miscontextualized videos, how do we follow these videos back to the original and perhaps see that it's being misrepresented? So going back to that story from Myanmar, you can see a whole bunch of the things that were missing in this case that are critical when we think about deepfake detection. As I said, we need deepfake detection that is relevant, accessible, useful, and complementary to user comprehension. And to the skills and capacity of journalists. And in this case, as I see it, the scenario went very wrong. You had open access tools without the ability to contextualize the results. So the open access tools you could encounter online weren't right for that form of manipulation if it existed, or were giving an erroneous result for a lack of manipulation. Limited public and journalistic understanding and no way to reach out. And again, you have to put this in the context of this liar's dividend, where it's very easy to say something is fake. Let me wrap up by spending 5 minutes talking about the other side of the technical developments in this space. So how do we provide tools for tracking image integrity, provenance, and manipulation rather than detecting the manipulation after the fact? And this is important because we've already seen with many deepfake detection tools that they are not as yet highly reliable, and even in the future, they're likely not to have really high detection capacities. We're not looking at tools that will spot saying 100% of the time because of the adversarial nature of deepfakes synthesis, and because as yet we do not have generalizable detection tools. So we need to look at tools that also track media origins and manipulation as another part of the toolkit. So as we look at this, we're looking at some what we might call as emerging trends in authenticity infrastructure. And I'm going to focus on the two on the right of this screen. So particularly tools for verified capture and verified publishing and sharing. So one way to think about verified capture tools are these are tools that maybe you have on your mobile device that, for example, may use a combination of rich metadata, AI-based checks at point of capture, hashing of the media, notarizing to a distributed ledger to better show what a piece of media looked like and some of the data around it when it was, for example, either captured on device or possibly synthesized in a deepfake process. And there are tools in this from both open source, Proof Mode is a tool that Witness works on, and the commercial sector like the company TruePic. However, the area that's really been growing in the last year and a half is the area of provenance standards in this authenticity infrastructure. And the big initiatives in this space are three called Project Origin, which comes out of media companies, including the BBC, the Content Authenticity Initiative that was founded by Adobe and Twitter and the New York Times, and the Coalition for Content Provenance and Authenticity, which is an umbrella standards organization, including those same companies, plus Microsoft, Intel, ARM, and a number of other entities. And Witness is a member of both these coalitions and has been part of the arguing for how do we build what we describe as a kind of context and authenticity infrastructure that works for all. And as Witness, we have a strong interest in this working well. We published one of the leading reports in this space that came out about a year and a half ago. And the reason we care about it is, of course, for the reasons I mentioned at the start of the talk, is that we know that people are constantly trying to film and share and videos and photos they share online. So we need to support people to be able to do that in both the most extreme circumstances. You film a piece of violence in front of you, also to, if you create something beautiful, you may want to be able to assert that it was you who did that and show how you created it. The main agenda we have in these discussions is trying to think about how do you create this authenticity infrastructure in a way that doesn't, that helps but doesn't harm. And what I mean by that is we're going from technical structures that are built as opt-in to ones that are much more driven by governments, by industry, by platforms. And as we do that, we need to really think about some key questions. And I'll share 4 or 5 questions that have informed our thinking around authenticity infrastructure and how to build this right. The first is how to do this in a way that doesn't exclude critical voices. So it doesn't exclude people who need to be private, who can't share their identity attached to a piece of media. So, for example, if you're a media activist working in a protest context in Mexico, or working in with communities facing dispossession from their land in indigenous communities in the US. How do you protect the privacy and anonymity of people while also allowing people to assert trust in media? So one thing we've been very focused on in the discussions around building these infrastructure is making sure they're not based on identity. So it's not a requirement that people have to provide identity to be trusted, because that doesn't work in many high-risk contexts. The second thing is we need to make sure we don't exclude people accidentally because of technical constraints. So if we build solutions to track media integrity and provenance, we need to remember that many people work with older OSs, may work with jailbroken phones. There's a funny story a colleague often shares about how Pokemon Go stopped working on jailbroken phones in Southeast Asia because of what the company had done, Niantic, but excluded, millions of people who wanted to use Pokemon Go. So we have to think, how are we not building a structure that de facto excludes people who may use older OSs, may use even feature phones, not smartphones. And then we need to think about these systems actually from a much more meta level, which is like, as we build them, and this is similar to the detection dilemma I was just describing, we need to be really careful we don't create kind of an assumption that something that has, for example, this data is necessarily more trustworthy than something that doesn't. And that we don't create a burden on people to feel like they have to add these signals to their media. So the reason I name the analogy to the detection scenario is we also need to make sure we don't imply that, whether something passes either a test of authenticity or a test of a deepfake detector is not conclusive, whether it is real, whether we should trust it, whether it's been manipulated. This is a signal. And we need to be very careful about, for example, often people want these kind of check marks on media saying, yes, you can trust it. We can't do that. We can give people signals that a piece of media might be manipulated. We can't confirm yes or no, and we can't confirm certainly the truth of the media. We can just tell you where it came from maybe, and how it's been manipulated. So finally, the thing we should be aware of in all these tools, and I think about it a lot with media manipulation, is many countries are passing laws around misinformation and fake news. And any tool or infrastructure we create around media manipulation, we should be aware that both good governments and governments who are misusing these laws will want to use them. For example, to claim that people need to attach their identity to media they share online, or there needs to be a way for governments to track back who created media. So as we build these infrastructure, we need to really be very focused on building a future that's really about kind of the ability for people to use these, for them to give people signals of what has been manipulated, but not trying to use these as a substitute for many of the other skills I've been talking about here, and the media literacies that we need to engage with a more complicated media environment. So with that, I will end talking and just highlight that, this is a complex environment where we need to really think thoughtfully about how we prioritize the threats and make sure we don't just look at the things that are most publicized by the media, and how we really pay attention to coming up with solutions that are often technical in nature, like deepfakes detection or authenticity infrastructure, but really informed by real world scenarios and the real people who use them. So lots more information at this link you'll see on screen. And I look forward to some questions. Thank you.
Thanks a lot, Sam. Very good, very nice presentation. I took some notes here, especially the one about signal of authenticity and provenance, and not the signal itself, right? So it's in forensics, we often advocate in that direction as well. You receive an object to authenticate or to say something about it. You can never say, yes, this is forged. No, this is authentic, because you only analyzed some elements, and they might allow someone to reach the conclusion of this is fake or not. But you should never say, yes, this is fake, this is not.
Yeah, let me say something to that also, Anderson, which I think that really unfortunately also plays into the liar's dividend problem. The way in which we think about media forensics makes it very hard to say it's real, yes, as well as say it's fake. And so we've seen this kind of like where people are like, well, you can't prove it's real, therefore I can continue saying it's fake. So it's complicated. We've got this real problem in media forensics of how to counter the sort of the way people can weaponize claims. Yeah.
Yes, yes. So thanks a lot for the presentation. So folks, we have about 20-25 minutes for questions. As usual, please use the hand signal in the reactions of Zoom, and I'll go over that reference. Or you can type your question in the chat and I'll go over them. So while people are still like ashamed of asking questions, I agree about the blinking problem. So this is a cat and mouse game, right? So any kind of algorithm that we develop that's going to be public, people can use them to create better tools. But you emphasize it in different places that many of the existing tools and technology right now, they focus on detecting itself, but we need a whole framework to deal with this problem, right? So you're not saying that detecting is not important. What you're saying is that we need more than that. Can you elaborate a bit more on that?
Yeah, I think there's a little bit of a tendency at the moment to sort of dismiss detection. And I think it's perhaps a little bit of the problem of like, for example, the results coming out of the deepfake detection challenge, which, were like, the winning algorithm was like 65% effective, which is not a great result when you look at that and you worry about effectiveness. I tend to think actually detection is important. And I think it's important to have a range of detection tools. The problem, and I think we see this in, a lot of the ways detection tools have been presented to date has been as kind of just like a kind of a menu of just like plug in your video and we'll tell you. And the problem being that, a detection tool that works well, for example, for, a lip sync dub may not be the appropriate one, either for a different way of generating that lip sync dub or for a different deepfake technique that, looks somewhat similar or may be present in that video. That said, I think the future of the detections is a combination of three things. Is we need these kind of ensembles of detection tools that give a range of results and provide a way to understand those results. But we need to combine this with two things that may actually be harder in the real world, which is how do you help people understand how to choose and understand those results? And actually, perhaps a bigger question is we need a broader media forensics capacity. I think that's what I saw in the Myanmar example is that most journalists didn't have that media forensics ability to even make those decisions. And we see globally that like that media forensics tends to sit in two places. It sits with researchers and academics who are, really understand the problem and are building the algorithms and the tools. And it often sits with law enforcement. And those are both important, of course, but it's not the whole picture. So I think we need this combination of better detection tools, but they need to be contextualized in both the way we present them and in these skills that people have in key communities, like journalists and key civic leaders in government and in, for example, election monitoring bodies and things like that, also very important. So I view it very much as don't dismiss detection, but do understand its limitations. And, I think the public doesn't understand the limitations either. And I think that's partly also because we've generated a fear about deepfakes. So people think anything could be a deepfake, when in fact it's more complicated to make the really complicated deepfakes that people are most afraid of.
Right. Very good. I have a question now from Alexandre Pupo. He says, due to the media propagation, deepfakes based on videos, images, or audio receive much more attention. However, Springer created a system called Beta Writer that generated most of the content of a scientific book, Lithium-ion Batteries, a machine-generated summary of current research. So what do you think, Sam? And he also asks me, what do you think about machines generating more serious text than weather summaries or news of sports or news summaries?
Yeah, no, thank you for answering that. And I did focus in my talk primarily on audio-visual generative models. And that's partly because, and I think there's two ways I'll answer the question. One is, I think audio-visual generative models are challenging because we do have both cognitive challenges in interpreting video that looks like real, and less learned experience of encountering it in the situations where we would expect video to be real. So It's a different type of thing to text, where almost all our experience of the text are highly mediated, right? We know text can be fake. Almost we know text is written and created in some sense, whether it be by a human author or an automated author or a human author aided by automation. I do think text is worrisome because it's clearly advancing very fast. You know, as we look at kind of GPT-3 and some of the models that have come out, you know, some recent research in China with very huge models and that are coming out, and we know that this is being used by the big tech giants, right? It's an integral part of what they're building in at, you know, at Microsoft and Google and presumably every other tech company. I think that there is, as I say, the reason I focus more on the audiovisual is I think it represents different attack vectors over time to those. I think the ways we need to think about automatic text generation, and this also applies somewhat to the deepfakes, is also kind of normatively where we hope this will be used, and kind of how do we transparent about where good actors use this. And you cite the example of like weather forecasters, so you can have the avatar and the automated kind of, you know, text of what they say. And that feels like something that's very easy to sort of explain to people and telegraph it to people, and we'll get used to that very quickly. It'll fit a norm. I think what we need to be careful of is places where people don't expect that a machine would create either video or text. And there we need to really think, how are we gonna say some things are out of bounds? And if you do that, it's not legitimate. And other places where we really need to signal it and just say, look, you should know this article was written by a machine, and perhaps, you know, you need to know that. These are blurry because frankly, we know that automated journalism is already here. It's just a question of how good it is and what it's used on.
Yes, I think that we have a very hard work ahead because, well, as you said, GPT-3 is here, but we are aware of models that are better than GPT-3 already. And this text generation, they become better and better. And, you know, detecting fakes in terms of text is much more difficult than images and videos because the traces left behind are more subtle. Now it's like a question based on your experience. You mentioned that we need to think about the tools that we have and that we develop, like, and ask how relevant they are for real world problems, right? So based on the cases that you at Witness have seen, do you think that we have some relevant, good detection methods right now? And if we don't, what are these tools missing? Yeah, so
I don't think we have tools that are relevant and accessible to most people who grapple with this. So that may be a user experience question as much as something else. Is simply most journalists, civic activists, people in, you know, frankly, in government globally don't have an understanding of which tools to use. So there's kind of an accessibility that's almost actually about UX and UI. I think the things that are, you know, pretty critical as gaps to address in detection tools are two, right? The first is what works well on compressed media. You know, it's clearly like almost everything you encounter is compressed. Often that might be deliberate counter-forensics, but frankly, in most cases, probably just, you know, it's been through social media. One of the big problems in the Myanmar case was people literally filmed that off the television and then stuck it in a deepfakes detector, which is like possibly the hardest scenario to actually try and do the detection.
Yeah,
no, it's like they literally did like counter-forensics as they did it, but it's actually what you'd expect people to do. If you actually think of a real world scenario, I'm going to take out my phone, I'm going to film it off the TV. I'm not going to go and try and work out, I don't have like, access to the original. So, you know, that's a really good example of like compressed, low resolution with existing forms of distortion that happen in a, you know, in a broadcast, for example. So that's one gap that is still not well addressed. The other is the generalizability, right? Is like, you know, and I think this is not necessarily always relevant. I think if you're particularly worried about sort of existing formats that might start to become accessible to not like the most sophisticated actor, they're not building a new deepfake synthesis model in order to do it. They're going to use something they find online, or they're going to get someone to do it for them. So generalizability to new models and new synthesis techniques is important, but it may not be that important as actually just having a way of presenting, you know, a good range of ways to detect some of the existing broadly used algorithms or tools that you can see in an easy UX, and then dealing with the compression. So actually I would prioritize in that order, sort of is like a good array of the tools that exist already that have come out of, for example, the metaphor semaphore program or that are coming out of academic research or face forensics or those other ones, or from, and then have those presented in a way that actually makes sense to help you know which one to pick, right? It can't be like, here's 8 tools, just drop it in and we'll tell you which. It has to be like, do you think the lips are manipulated? You should try this one and this one and this one. If they all give you a 95% result, you should then start to do the other stages of thinking about it. And then the more complex technical question is the compression and the low resolution one.
And one limitation of most of the techniques right now is that they don't have the explainability factor, right?
Yeah.
So many of them, they just provide yes or no, sometimes with some probability, but definitely not with the like heat map of what regions were used to allow the detection. So I think that one challenge here as well is introducing explainability to these techniques, right?
Yeah. And I think it's important to think about explainability as both AI explainability, which often in the AI community means one thing, versus explainability to two audiences, to a public. So like, any of us encountering something, but also explainability to, say, a journalist. So, journalists, much like media forensics people, look for signals, but they don't take any one thing as a confirmation, right? If, if I look at a piece of media, I'm going to try and work out where it came from. I'm going to do some analysis of the actual image. I'm going to try and find someone else who took a similar video. I'm going to try and find out whether
the signal is going to be one part of the aspect, right?
Exactly.
Yeah.
So thinking about this role of signals, both detection signals and authenticity and provenance signals.
Right. So I have now a question from Rafael Padilla. As we discussed, forensics and counterforensics, they play a cat and mouse game, with a counterforensics often exploiting the weaknesses of forensics approaches to improve itself. So when we consider deepfake generation, the limit would be for digital forensics achieving an extreme degree of realism, such that neither human nor automatic solutions could assert its authenticity. Do you think our efforts should be more on the human aspect of it, like bringing the human to the loop? Example, educating society not to blindly trust shared content, and less on the technical automatic solution aspect of it?
Yeah, and I think you're going to the heart of the question, Raphael, is we need complementarity between both of those. I also think we need to be careful, and this goes to the threats from deepfakes now. Right, as I said, the threats now are primarily gender-based violence towards women, and this liar's dividend, the ability to say something true is false. And I hear far more often people saying it's a deepfake about real things than it's a deepfake about actual deepfakes. So we have to be careful as we do the societal education, not to make sure we don't actually make people think that most media can't be trusted. Right, most media is not manipulated maliciously. Most videos are not deep faked, so we need to be very careful that we think about them kind of going in parallel tracks. So we need to be saying, how do we keep improving detection tools, even knowing that there may be an end game where somehow we can't detect things, right? And some people in the community say we will reach that point, right? But in the short run, we should be investing in detection, right? And we need to invest in smart work with society that's not trying to panic people. And I think that's the balance, is like, often I'm trying to de-escalate people and say, you're not surrounded by deepfakes. You probably don't need to worry. We need to get journalists and fact checkers and community leaders to understand this, so that when we start to see them, they're well prepared. We need to have this way to escalate a potential deepfake so people aren't caught out, like in the Myanmar case. But we should be careful about scaring people. And I think the argument for the authenticity and provenance approaches is that if you can go that direction, you're kind of safeguarding a little bit better for the moment where potentially deepfake detection tools really can't work, and you're doing harm reduction. A lot of this is, there's always going to be someone who's going to fool us, right? There always has been, there always will be. And we want to think about ways in which we build in these authenticity and provenance. I think the other place that's really critical now, and it's an area we're doing some work on that will come out in the next few months, is how do you really get the creators and developers of these technologies to really think about the guardrails they voluntarily place on their tools, and what is allowable and what is not. It may be that legislators legislate this, right? Like that we will see this, and we're starting to see it in Europe. The recent draft AI legislation includes what is potentially a labeling requirement.
And France is an example, right? All magazines
Yeah.
should put the label saying that the image was manipulated somehow.
Exactly. So we probably will see labeling legislation in Europe and possibly elsewhere. But we need also norms work that really says, if you're creating this amazing app that allows you to sort of do face swaps or do lip sync dubbing, what are the guardrails you're placing on that? Are you allowing anyone to use it? Do you allow anyone to swap both the background and the face? Or do you limit what can be done with each? Do you ban users who use it in ways that are not acceptable, like non-consensual sexual images, right? We're going to start moving into that terrain that, frankly, social media companies have not done a great job with historically. So we need to really put the pressure of what we want from this ability to manipulate media.
Right. We often see that the hype about deepfakes, they are most likely related to politics, right?
Yeah.
So whenever we have a campaign, especially presidential campaigns, US, Brazil, and other places, there are a lot of buzz about deepfakes. But based on your experience, do we still have most of the cases in revenge porn, and not so much in politics?
Yeah, I think the key case still are these non-consensual sexual images, sometimes known as revenge porn or non-consensual intimate images. The figure that I showed was 96%. That's from about a year ago. I think it's a hard number to know because there was a recent statistic from one of the face swapping apps that you can use on Android and Apple that said, I think that 3 billion images had been generated with their tool. So if that's true, then the number of non-consensual sexual images is much smaller relative to that. But certainly for the malicious usages, non-consensual sexual images, and these liars' dividend claims that something real is fake, I don't think we should discount the political mis and disinformation. We've heard that in meetings that, certainly people who work on high-level mis and disinformation say, look, at a certain point, it'll be worth doing this. It's just we center too much on that. And those are the people who are most well defended. So I'm sure in the Brazil elections next year, we'll see both examples of claimed deepfakes, around corruption or sex scandals or things like that. And we'll see potentially some use of, GAN-generated images. Maybe there will be a deepfake. But at the same time, under the surface, we'll be seeing many uses of non-consensual sexual images, many people local level saying that a video that maybe has them saying something embarrassing is a deepfake when it's not. So I think we need to pay attention to that level a lot, as well as recognizing we will see these kind of high-level cases.
Very good. Yeah, I agree. People, they often claim, yeah, politics this, politics that, but right now, the people that are getting hurt by this kind of technology is like women that have their images published somehow online, right? So I have another question now from Didier Vega Oliveiros. Is it not a dangerous path, this continuous improving of deepfake, object edit et al. For society? I mean, if the technology gets too perfect, do you think it will bring a problem of distinguishing reality or the so-called post-truth politics?
Yeah, I think there's, I think it's reasonable to assume that more and more media production and creation in our world is going to be involved synthetic production, right? So I think we have to be, it's how we kind of build our accommodation with that reality, right? Because that also has tremendous creative power. I come out of a video and television background many years ago, and I can see like how this is potentially very powerful and empowering to be able to, create much more synthetic images. Like, I find the Nerf research fascinating. Like as an example, I'm like, wow, this is very cool. I use this. So I think it's more about how we reach sort of our accommodation about what's acceptable and what we expect. So you could say, for example, we're going to do, synthesis is going to happen, but we're going to make sure that we, at the norms level, make sure that there's always labeling of stuff that could deceive someone in ways they wouldn't expect. So we might not expect in a drama, right, that we know that synthesis has been used, but in a news article, we need to know, right? You need to label it. And we might want to say, we always want, synthesis to be easily forensically detectable. And for anyone who creates synthetic techniques, to make sure they help people doing detection to make sure they can detect their synthesis, right? So those are things you can do that are basically making it much more likely that harmful uses are reduced and creative uses are increased. And then we can start, really investing in these detection and authenticity ones to try and help good actors do well, right? Like to give the markers of trust and to deal with reducing the harms from people who use it maliciously by using the detection. We somewhat feel the genie is out the bottle on the bigger scientific advance, but we have to think about like kind of our solutions across the range, right? From detection and authentication for bad actors and good actors to kind of norms around how we create these tools and how they're visibly labeled, how they're invisibly easily detectable, so that we're able to understand this ecosystem in a way that enables us to not just throw our hands in the air. I think we have to be very careful. Like there is a lot of true footage in the world. People do want to share truth. We can't let ourselves get into that space.
Thanks a lot. Jacques, please go ahead.
Wait just a minute. Let me start my camera. Okay. Sam, thank you for the talk. It was very interesting. But there was one in particular that I never heard, so I want you to elaborate a little bit longer on this. Audio fake, right? So really, as you realize, audio is important, or at least the WhatsApp infrastructure is very important in Brazil, probably in other countries, but I had never heard of the story of audio faking. So how important it is, what's happening on that? Because if there's an area that I never thought would be a fake, it's audio fake, but it's probably easier to detect or harder to detect, right? Because there's less information being transferred. So please, if you could elaborate a little bit on what's the impact of audio fake or stories about it. Thank you.
Yeah, so I think there's a number of ways to think about audio and synthesis and faking. So one is, there's definitely progress in creating better audio. So, creating a clone of someone's voice or a skin on someone else's voice in order to be able to sound like someone else. And we've started to see what are understood to be deep-faked audio used primarily actually in business context to try and do kind of, get someone to wire some money or something like that. I'm always a little cautious about those stories because often they rely on someone describing a phone call and they don't actually have the audio of the phone call. And, maybe they were just fooled by a good impersonator. We just had an incident in Europe where someone called in to a bunch of parliamentary committees claiming to be the aide to the Russian dissident Navalny, and turned out it was an impersonator wearing a bathrobe, and it was just like totally ridiculous, and everyone called it a deep fake when in fact it was just an impersonator. But clearly the synthesis is improving, and I would say the reason to worry about it is partly exactly what you're saying, is like there are less semantic clues around audio, right? Like in a video we have the clues, like does it look right in the background? Are there often a similar recording, maybe from the same scene? Audio, you don't typically have those additional clues, which, say a journalist would use to work out if something's faked. So we're disadvantaged with audio. We're also disadvantaged because, as you noted, and as I was saying in the talk, it is a primary mode of what people do in many countries on WhatsApp. Less so in the US. In the US, people often don't think about it, but in, say, Brazil or Mexico or Indonesia, a very powerful mode of sharing information. We haven't seen a lot of deepfake audio shared yet in WhatsApp, so I want to be careful not to make people think that it's a common phenomenon. What we have seen are edited audio clips. So we know that people think about the opportunity to use shared audio clips as a mode for disinformation. So people will share an audio clip that's been edited to change the order or to cut out a key sentence that came before. So that sort of, if you look at kind of both the trend line on the technology side, you look at the trend line on the ways people already do misinformation. Most people don't innovate; they just do the next version of what they've done before. That's why we should worry about it. And I suspect we'll start to see some in the next year in kind of WhatsApp heavy environments because it lends itself so well, and unfortunately we're not well equipped to do work on that. And I think we would have similar problems to what we had in the Myanmar case, right? It'd be very hard for people to work out who do I check this with? You'd get someone saying, this sounds fake because I know that person's voice, but we wouldn't know whether that was because it was a bad recording or a fake or an impersonator, etc.
Thanks a lot, Sam.
Thank
We
you.
have two last questions. The first is from Jin Yang. Is the detection of miscontextualized videos or images more difficult? Since they may not be manipulated, what are the methods to detect these types of shallow fakes that you have seen?
Thank you, Jin Yang. Yeah, I think the detection of shallow fakes, there's a couple of ways to be thinking about it. Some content, of course, exists in databases of known fakes or media that's in some way been hashed, right? So you might use, different forms of hashing that allow for, similar versions, which is how, for example, platforms like Facebook, spot duplicates or near duplicates of not only mis and disinformation, but potentially, sexual content that doesn't belong on the site or terrorist and violent extremist content. Those algorithms are not always accurate, right, to do that, detection. And there is a problem, of course, that you can tag something as fake when it isn't. So, for example, there's a real problem when, for example, if, a fact checker in India, for example, sees a video from China that purports to show police violence and it's claimed in India to be of India, you tag it as fake, right? Because it's not fake, it's fake in the Indian context, but it's real in the Chinese context. And we need to understand which one we're placing it in and make sure we don't pollute our database with inaccurate information that, goes through it. The big gap that we've heard and we've been pushing in our advocacy, and I think it's a really interesting technical challenge, is how to have better and more broadly available reverse video search. So typically in a platform, you can do what's known as reverse image search, which is look for example, keyframes or images from a video and run it through Google image search or TinEye or Yandex or a number of search engines. And that's one way to search for a video, but ideally we would have better ways of doing reverse video search. So you could put a video into a platform and within certain limits be able to see whether it existed previously. So I think that ability to know and then to show that to people, like one of the biggest problems in platforms is not being able to show people that the video they just watched that said it was from yesterday in Rio was actually from last year in Sao Paulo or Porto Alegre or whatever it might be, right? So, be able to do that really smoothly is a big technical challenge. It's a huge corpus you need to navigate. It's a huge technical question. So finding streamlined ways to do that. I think often when people look at the authenticity provenance, they're trying to find a way to avoid having to do that. But I think the two are going to coexist, like reverse video and image search, hash databases that exist already, and then new forms of authenticity infrastructure.
Muted. The last one from João Felipe. Thanks for the nice presentation. There is a claim that says that misinformation spread more quickly than the real corrected version of it. In this sense, how do you think that this claim applies to deepfakes? Is there any concern on the Provenance projects on helping to spread the corrected version of information? Yeah, no, these questions have been great because this is a fundamental problem, right? And I think it was originally probably not this. Probably people have said this since we were climbing out of our caves, that the lies spread faster than the truth. And I think it's a real challenge. That misinformation spreads quickly, particularly when it taps into the reasons why misinformation is effective, right? So it's emotional, it taps into an existing story. There's a lot of work coming out now around kind of how people use existing sort of story fields that they populate with a new rumor or misinformation, and it fits our pre-existing mental maps. Like we believe elections are fraudulent, say, for example, for a group of people in the US right now, or we believe that politicians are corrupt, et cetera, et cetera. And so misinformation fits both our existing tropes or sort of fields of understanding, and it often plays on our emotions. And similarly, fact checks are often, and kind of challenging misinformation is often about saying no and using science to explain it, or like a deep fake detector or authenticity signals. So we are disadvantaged. And I don't think that's going away. And that's why we need to have the media literacy approaches. And you'll see the one I described, the SIFT methodology, starts with stop, because we actually need to stop people sharing this too quickly and say, pause before sharing something seems too good to be true, too easy to fit your preconceptions, too emotionally engaging.
I think it is a gap with the authenticity and provenance solutions. They are not yet thinking how to propagate the fact check or the sort of authenticity check well. That's why it's important as we start to think about it, we think about the role of platforms. How do they show this information, and how do they show the reverse video search that shows that a video pre-existed? Otherwise, as you say, the lie will spread faster than the truth, and the ability to challenge the lie will reach far fewer people, which is the other thing. The lie spreads faster, and the corrections reaches fewer people. So we've got to think about both of those dynamics in order to address this.
It's that old problem, right? Someone says something in the newspaper, and it's like it's fake, so people read it, buy it, but when the corrected version comes, only a few will buy, and it's just a line of correction. Yes,
exactly. Page 7 at the bottom in small print.
Exactly. So Sam, thank you very much for your time and for your very nice presentation. It was a pleasure to have you here today.
Thank you. Thank you for the invitation.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Everyone, I will send you the link of the YouTube video once I upload it. Okay, so stay safe. Thank you very much for your presence. Bye-bye.